Hey, Larry here. Acts 29 today. Coming to you from Sunny World headquarters in Chiang Mai, Thailand. I'd like to welcome all my viewers today from Thailand and around the world to this edition. Well, last time I left you, I was just getting to the Bangkok airport, and my friend Kevin, I had no idea of how I was really going to find him in this airport, but thank God when I got off the plane and headed down the terminal, he was coming the other way and saw me and shouted out to me, and we met up. So that's the price you pay for flying free. Even though it's free, there's a price to pay in missed flights and miscommunications and stuff happening that, you have no control over. So, there are variables to it, and that's why we call it flying by faith. So I was well on my way to walking out what I had prayed out in the truck, and as always, I had to pinch myself to see if it was real. It was real, and now I was traveling to many lands and many people, and all of those countless hours of praying in the Spirit in a truck was well worth the time that it took to end up here. So when you fly a lot, sometimes people you're sitting next to will ask you stuff like, well, what do you do? They want to know what you're doing for a living. So I always said, well, I'm living the life I always imagined I would. And that kind of was a good conversation starter, kind of caught them off guard. And of course, it opened up a whole world of dialogue if the person was wanting to talk further. You see, there were many years in the most troubling times of my life when I would go park by the runway at Portland International Airport and watch the planes take off and land. I would also read my Bible and listen to teaching tapes there for hours and hours and hours. So that's just me on a flight, and then this is a parking lot by the Portland airport where I used to park and watch the planes and read the word and pray and listen to tapes. And I did that for hours and hours and hours, days and days and days. Also, I would imagine that I was on one of those planes taking off and going somewhere to minister, or on my way back from a trip somewhere that I was ministering at. And all of my t-shirts had airplanes on them as I was wearing the vision. I was wearing the vision. I was imagining myself doing what God had called me to do, and I was also wearing the vision. And I happen to have one of those t-shirts on today. So people will tell you in those days that knew me, all of my t-shirts looked like this. They all had an airplane on them. This says, "Long live the Queen." And it's not talking about the Queen of Thailand. It's talking about the Queen of the Skies, 747-400. It was my favorite plane. Of all the planes I flew on the last 50 years, 747 was the most comfortable plane to fly on, long haul. And there's not many of them left. So I'm glad that I had the years that I had to fly on the 747s. So all my t-shirts had had these planes on them as I was wearing the Vision. I would also go to the airport with a carry-on bag and walk down the boarding area. This was pre 9/11, of course. And then I'd get in line like I was going to board the plane. And when I got close to the jetway, I would just walk away and go on down and wait for an arriving flight and then walk out with the arriving passengers as if I had just got back. This is called faith in action. I was acting out my faith, what I believed that I had received. I was acting out in real life, like it was already happening. So that was my faith in action. I was acting out by faith what I believed I would be doing someday. And I know it sounds crazy, like Jacob putting spotted sticks in the watering troughs of the cattle, and they all gave birth to spotted young. So I spent a lot of time imagining what I believed the perfect will of God for my life was. And so when people ask me, what do you do? I would always say, I'm living the life I always imagined I would. So let's move on. Thailand has made up the majority of the mission trips of my life, and now I live here full time as well, and it's a wonderful country also to base out of. The feeling of knowing that you have prayed out God's perfect will for your life is so amazing. No more guesswork, no more I think so, or maybe, but just knowing that you're being led day by day by His perfect plan for you, and nothing is better than that. Okay, well, let's take another trip. Let's go to Africa, because I went to Africa many times. I don't remember just how many, but this was one of my favorite photographs that I took in Africa. This was, I believe, in Zambia, and I was in this truck, and these kids walked up to the door, and I put the window down, and this girl looked in, and her eyes were just so amazing. And I took this picture, and to this day, I still remember. This was another little guy when I was out in the bush. These kids were amazing. So I flew to Johannesburg, South Africa, met up with a team there, and then we flew to Zambia. I was traveling with a team of Australians, and one of the places was way out in the bush. And this was a picture of me out in the bush there somewhere. We were a long ways out in the middle of nowhere. And so we would teach. It was a pastor's conference, and so we'd teach all day, and then at night it was so dark, and they only had a few kerosene lanterns for light that you couldn't even see the people. The road out to the village was so full of potholes, it took hours and hours just to go 30 miles. This team also worked with a couple Australians from their church there, and they had a small house on a lake there, and they had shipped over a boat. It happened to be like a drag boat with a 427 engine. And then they would go up the Kafu River as far as they could go, and then they would just drift downstream, and they'd stop at all the different villages on the way and show the Jesus film at different places. And we went to this little house one time, and they took me out on the lake, and it was unbelievable. You know, we'd drive the boat into a flock of these big birds, and the birds would take off, and then we'd go right underneath them, and I could have reached up and grabbed a bird right out of the sky. I mean, there were so many of them, and it was so amazing. But in those days, you know, we didn't have smartphones and all this stuff, so we couldn't take the pictures that we can today. So, you know, I missed a lot of stuff that I could have taken. We hooked up with a team from New Zealand. They had a big truck with a container, one side folded down to make a stage. They'd play music, and then they'd set up a large screen on top, and they'd show the Jesus film. So we traveled with them for some crusade meetings, and this was up on the side of that container that they had turned into a stage and stuff. And so it was called Africa for Jesus, and they drove that around to different towns and cities. That's me in the back there with the sunglasses on, and just a bunch of the kids. This was an amazing evening. They asked me to give the call for salvation at the crusade, and we were out on a soccer field, and there was about, I don't know, they said there was 10 or 15, 20,000 people there that night to watch the Jesus film. That's me with my hand up there with the wristwatch on. And so anyway, I gave the salvation call that night. And there was 3,000 or 4,000 people came forward, you know, to receive Christ that night. So it was an amazing time there for me to be able to experience this kind of stuff. Of course, the spiritual darkness there in Africa was just amazing and unreal. And, you know, I heard stories that I wasn't even sure I believed. But, you know, these guys had grown up. They had grown up there as kids, and some of them had fathers who were witch doctors. And so they had lived with this witchcraft and darkness for their whole life. And so for them to know that there were witches that flew in baskets and on sticks, and people could trans-shift into animals and back and forth and that kind of stuff, you know, that was normal to them. You know, that was normal life. When I got back to the States, I remember I was at a pastor friends of mine place, and they had a little prayer meeting one morning. So there was like 4 or 5 pastors and got together, and he said, well, Larry just got back from Africa. I want him to share a little bit. And so I was sharing a little bit about this crusade, and then talking to these guys about the witchcraft and darkness in Africa. And when I was talking about some of this stuff, these pastors, their eyes got as big as saucers, and they were looking around the room like, this guy is whacked out of his mind, man. So, you know, but it's just because they've never been there, never experienced anything like that in the demonic realm. So anyway, I will catch you on the next video, and we will continue on this journey.